Up until the moment the One Ring plunged into the fires of Mount Doom, the Third Age had been a fairly successful era for Sauron. Over the course of millennia, his enemies had been weakened to the point where it seemed like victory was just a matter of when, not if. But while Sauron remained in hiding, regathering his strength, it was one of his servants who did the heavy lifting, the Witch King of Angmar. So, what were the Witch King's powers? What made him so successful? So, who is the Witch King of Angmar? He's the leader of the Nazgul, the 9 men who accepted rings of power from Sauron who eventually became corrupted and ended up turning into ringwraiths, Black Riders, Ulari if you're feeling fancy. We don't know much about the Witch King's past. He was probably a Númenórean, but he was clearly Sauron's most favoured servant, and was responsible for much of Sauron's success in the Third Age. In particular, he was infamous for being responsible for the destruction of Arnor, and was Gondor's main foe after he captured Minas Ithil and corrupted it into the deathly Minas Morgul. Before I go any further, I just want to say that like many powerful figures in Tolkien's universe, the exact extent of the Witch King's powers are unclear. If you've watched my video about Nazgul misconceptions, you'll know that a lot of the information about them isn't exactly concrete in nature, and that there's a decent amount of debate about them. Also, while the video will focus on the Witch King of Angmar, it must also be said that it's unclear whether some of his powers are exclusive to him, or whether they are shared by all the Nazgul. I'm going to start with some of the powers that we know are shared. Although considered to be a powerful warrior, the greatest weapon of the Witch King and his fellow Nazgul was fear. The Nazgul possessed a supernatural aura of fear that only the bravest could overcome. If overwhelmed, a person would become both physically and mentally incapacitated. Their bodies would freeze, causing them to drop their weapons, and their minds would fill with thoughts of only darkness and death. This aura was so great that even if a Nazgul couldn't be seen or heard, their presence could still be felt. The Nazgul used this to great effect during the War of the Ring. Boromir claimed that it was this unseen fear which caused the Gondorians to lose the eastern half of Osgiliath, and during the Siege of Gondor, the Nazgul constantly circled Minas Tirith from above to sap the will of the defenders. It's also worth a mention that Sauron's forces would have been nowhere near as effective if not for the fear of the Witch King and the other Nazgul keeping them in line. But even if one could overcome the aura of fear, they would be faced with something far more deadly, the Black Breath. How exactly the Black Breath worked is unknown, but like their fear, it seemed to be a poisonous aura of some kind. However, considering it didn't affect everyone that they came in contact with, after all, they did have several conversations during the hunt for the ring, it seems to have been something akin to a passive that they could toggle on or off if we're going to talk about this in video game terms. Prolonged exposure could cause someone to fall ill, then unconscious, and then finally die. But interestingly enough, in Bree, Merry gets exposed to it and falls unconscious, but seems to suffer no other ill effects upon awaking. Like I said, we're not exactly sure how it works. The Nazgul are also rather difficult to kill. There's some debate on what exactly is required to kill them, but at the very least, we can be assured that they are quite durable. They survive a flash flood at the River Bruinen that killed their horses, and later in the story, a Nazgul survives falling after his fell beast mount is shot out from underneath him by Legolas. In the case of the Witch King, it's stated that any weapon that strikes him will break. That's regardless of whether it was enchanted or not, or whether it struck a killing blow or not. There's also some debate on whether the Nazgul could be resurrected or given new bodies by Sauron. I cover this more during my aforementioned Nazgul misconceptions video. And the Nazgul also developed some interesting powers and weaknesses as a result of them being mortal men that became wraiths. For one, they mostly existed in the spirit world. This meant that they couldn't interact with the physical world unless specifically cloaked to do so. They were also weaker in general during daylight, with their vision being particularly bad unless faced with another creature that had a large presence in the spirit world, for example, Glorfindel or Frodo when he wore the One Ring. That being said, the Nazgul had a good sense of smell, and could allegedly smell the blood of living creatures. They could also sense the presence of the One Ring, but it seems the sense could also be easily clouded, given the Nazgul were close to the One Ring on several occasions without actually realizing it. They are stated as having a fear of fire, and there's also some debate about whether they feared water too, especially elvish waters such as the Bruinen. But if this was the case, then the Witch King's fear of both elements was lesser, as he both summoned fire and was the first to enter the waters of the Bruinen. Alright, so those are the powers that are definitely shared, but the Witch King demonstrates plenty of powers that the other Nazgul do not. However, that doesn't mean the other Nazgul were incapable of those powers. It just means that the Witch King was a more prominent character, so we see him do much more than the other Nazgul. It's possible that the following powers are just exclusive to the Witch King, or that all the other Nazgul could do them as well, with perhaps the Witch King simply being the most adept. As you would expect from his name, the Witch King was a powerful sorcerer, and he did love to show off. He could empower items in his own possession, such as lighting his sword on fire, but he was also capable of weakening or destroying other objects. At the Fort of Bruinen, he destroyed Frodo's sword with a simple raise of his hand, and during the Siege of Gondor, it was his spells that allowed Gron to shatter the gates of Minas Tirith to pieces, as if they had been struck and exploded by lightning. When Sauron gave the order for the Morgul host to set forth, the Witch King answered by sending forth blue forks of lightning into the sky from the Tower of Minas Morgul and the surrounding hills. Aragorn and the Hobbits also witness a similar lightning display near Weathertop when Gandalf is fighting the Nazgul there, although it's unclear who was responsible. There's also speculation that the Witch King had some control over the weather and the climate. His final invasion of Arthedain came in the midst of a particularly harsh winter, and the following year, the Lossoth told King Arvedui that the Witch King could cause frost or thaw at his will. It's also interesting that when Angmar initially rose to power, the climate of eastern Eriador grew noticeably worse, which caused the hobbits to migrate west or east back over the Misty Mountains. However, given the climate of Eriador didn't really improve after the destruction of Angmar, it's possible that the Witch King had no impact on the weather, and the worsening climate in Eriador was just a natural process. Like I said, this was a claim by the Lossoth, and it's never confirmed. But he also had powers that were far more sinister. One such power was necromancy, no doubt taught to him by Sauron himself. Necromancy was the dark art of binding spirits, possibly elven or other types of fell spirits, to the corpses of the dead. The Witch King used this to great effect in the Barrow Downs in the aftermath of the Great Plague in 1636. With most of the remaining men of Cardolan dead due to the plague, the Witch King sent evil spirits to inhabit the corpses of the dead men buried there, thus creating the Barrow-wights. For the next 1400 years, the Barrow Downs would remain a place of terror, and any attempts to resettle it would end in failure. During the hunt for the ring, the Witch King briefly revisited the Barrow Downs and ordered the Wights to keep watch. If not for the aid of Tom Bombadil, Frodo and his companions likely would have met their ends there. Another of his major powers was based around the word Morgul, which means dark sorcery, and there was no better example of dark sorcery than Minas Morgul itself. Once a Gondorian city called Minas Ithil, under the Witch King's occupation, Minas Morgul became an absolutely horrific place. Thanks to the Witch King's corruption, everything about Minas Morgul and its surrounding valley was deadly. The waters of the Morgul Duin River were poisonous, and it gave off cold steam that could make one ill. The flowers in the valley, while beautiful in a twisted and demented way, let off noxious vapours that could drive men mad. So deep was the corruption that Aragorn ordered the fields burned, and after the War of the Ring, the city was completely destroyed. It's no exaggeration to say that the Witch King's corruption of Minas Morgul left it possibly the worst place in Middle-earth at that point in time. Even comparable places such as Mirkwood and Mordor had redeeming qualities. For example, in Mordor there was still actually drinkable water despite the land being a volcanic wasteland. And even though Mirkwood was a dark, terrifying forest, men and elves still lived there, and the forest did end up recovering on its own volition afterwards. The fact that Minas Morgul needed to be completely destroyed says a lot. Of course, the Witch King's dark sorcery did not just affect Minas Morgul and its environs. The most famous example of Morgul sorcery would be the poison that was carried in Morgul blades, weapons used by the Nazgul, and probably their servants. We get to see this in action. the Witch King's Morgul blade lodged a piece of itself in Frodo's shoulder, and had it reached his heart, it would have turned him into a wraith. Even after he was healed, the wound would cause Frodo severe pain on the anniversary of its infliction, or whenever he heard the Witch King's voice. Frodo was not the only one to sustain a Morgul wound. Steward Boromir of Gondor also received a Morgul wound whilst fighting against the forces of Mordor back in the late 25th century. Despite being a mighty warrior that even the Witch King feared, Boromir was left so weakened by the wound that it caused him an early death. He lived to be 79 when he should have easily passed 100. And that's it. Well, I say that's it like I haven't just went through a vast array of powers. Like I've said in similar types of videos, Tolkien was always vague when it came to magic and sorcery. He doesn't really give definitive statements or lists explaining what characters could and couldn't do. But despite that, we can recognise how powerful the Witch King and the Nazgul were. They inspired supernatural fear, they had an aura of death surrounding them, they were hard to kill, they could empower and destroy objects, they could poison people and the very environment around them. They were exceptionally valuable assets to Sauron, especially so considering that they were completely enslaved to his will and couldn't go rogue. They were near enough to perfect servants, and Sauron's position in the Third Age would have been far worse without them. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. I did a video on Morgoth's powers, and Sauron's powers too, so I felt like it was fitting to do a video on the Witch King, as the final part of the trifecta, I guess you could say. As far as villains go, maybe Saruman is left to do, but going by my YouTube analytics, no one actually gives a shit about Saruman. I guess that's what happens when you're sort of just a shitty Sauron knockoff who was a last minute addition to the story. Anyway, cheers, farewell, and remember, the Witch King may be a scary guy, but you can just call him Sauron's bitch boy, and there's really nothing he can come back with because it's completely true.